Hello again, everyone. I'm Simon Haines. Welcome back to the Ramsay Centre's Distinguished Speaker Series for 2021. Now, in recent months, we've returned more than once to the theme of liberalism. Patrick Deneen has told us that it's run its course. Deirdre McCloskey, more optimistically, has said that it has made us rich. Now, today we're going to shift ever so slightly sideways to talk about liberty itself, or rather freedom, which is probably much the same thing. And we are delighted to have as our guest to talk to us about freedom and threats to freedom in various contemporary contexts, the Right Honourable the Lord Hannan of Kingsclere, a celebrated British author, columnist, and political figure. Lord Hannan is the Vice Chairman and the International Ambassador of the Conservative Party in the UK. He's a member of the UK Board of Trade. He's the President of the Initiative for Free Trade. He was a member of the European Parliament for over 20 years. And of course, he was the founder of Vote Leave, the precursor political movement which eventually led to Brexit. Daniel Hannan has written 9 books, including the bestseller How We Invented Freedom. He teaches at the University of Buckingham and also the University of Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala. And he's no doubt familiar to many of you from his columns in the Sunday Telegraph, the Washington Examiner, the Wall Street Journal, and of course, the Australian. Indeed, he visited this country as recently as 2 years ago, just before all this COVID business. This time, I'm afraid we had to make do with Zoom, but maybe that's a good preamble to our topic, our title today, which is The Last Straw. Has COVID finally broken freedom's back? So, Lord Hannan, thank you so much for joining us this morning, your time. And
well, thank you, Simon, and good day, everyone.
Pleasure to welcome you. And perhaps I will start by asking you perhaps a more personal question, just to lead into our discussion of freedom. Now, you grew up in a British family on a farm outside Lima in Peru, but you went to boarding school and university in the UK, in England. And I think in the course of your travels, you've written about this, backwards and forwards for holidays and so on. You started to develop some strong views about the differences that you perceived about what's often called the Anglosphere and the rest of Western civilization, mainly European, and particularly the difference between the British settlements in North America and the Spanish ones in South America. And these were views which became clearer and stronger once you began your long association with the EU. So can we just start, perhaps you tell us a little bit about this process of personal development, and in particular, the evolution through all of this of your conceptions of freedom and I guess also civilization.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. It's a great pleasure to be here. I mean, a very big formative moment for me was when I was 5 years old and a mob attacked our family farm. This isn't the kind of thing you forget. I vividly recall my mother taking me by the hand to the kind of footpath that led out through the back into the hills and saying, "We're going to play a game. If we have to come this way again, we mustn't make a sound." And this was the Peru General Velasco. There were land seizures and there was chaos everywhere. But only much later did the really shocking thing strike me, which is that no one had been especially surprised. It was taken for granted in a country like that the law was contingent, that constitutions came and went, that property was insubstantial. And that was really when I began to think there's something here that distinguishes Britain from what we loosely call the West. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the Hispanosphere exactly the way it is, but it was not exactly the same civilization. And then I began to ponder. I mean, let me put the question like this. We had all the rows when Trump wanted to control the border, but why has no Mexican politician ever needed to propose a wall along the border to keep all the gringos out? Right? why do we take for granted that the movement of people is overwhelmingly one way? And you might say, well, that's kind of a silly question. It's obvious, because on the other side you have good schools and tarmacked roads and reliable electricity and water supply and uncorrupt judges and regular elections and uncensored newspapers. But why? Why do we have those things on one side of the wall and not on the other? You know, when the Americas were settled, if anything, South America had the edge in terms of resources. Spain certainly had the edge over Britain. It was the leading country in the world at that time. And I think the answer is that the English-speaking settlers brought with them to their new home a treasure that was more valuable than all of the silver in Potosi. And this was a way of arranging their affairs so that governments were in some sense answerable to the people, and law was elevated above the biggest guy in the community, that there was this invisible force that applied equally to everyone. And that really was the beginning of my journey of looking at why did that extraordinary thing happen overwhelmingly in the language which you and I are now talking.
Thank you. And you've written also, we might get back to this a bit later, about the history of Whiggism and the basic principles of freedom that were baked into it right at the start. But we'll return to that. Now, forgive me, but we can't have Daniel Hannan on our show and not ask something about Brexit. So in a way, this is a development of what you've just been talking about, I guess, if we can move into that kind of quite defining era of your life in many ways. During your long stint as an MEP, member of the European Parliament for South East England, you became ever more active and vocal as a critic of the EU and its institutions, not just the Parliament where you were serving, but also the Commission. So can you tell us something about this next part of your life, this cause that you have given so much to, what you learned at close quarters about the Parliament? What is it actually like? Has it changed over the years? How do you see it evolving? What about the mindset, the motivation of those who actually run the EU in both the Commission and the Parliament? And I suppose also part of this is the attitudes of the political and media elites in Paris and Berlin as well. I mean, one wouldn't want to say that this is an anti-freedom or anti-democratic kind of set of values that we're talking about here, but are there some sort of ancient, I don't know, kind of radical differences of the conception of freedom or liberty on both sides of that narrow body of water called the Channel?
I think there are. There are these unseen ley lines that still define how we look at things today. I mean, has it changed? Of course it's changed. I was there for 21 years. When I arrived, you know, we came with physical travel documents, you know, that we had to get from a travel agent. And you know, our constituents wrote to us on paper with envelopes and stamps, right? So an awful lot changed. But one thing that never changed was the attitude of the people who ran Brussels, which was that Europe was always the answer to every question. Europe, right or wrong, that the cause mattered more than democracy or the rule of law or obeying referendums or impartiality or personal liberty or any other precept. And this fundamentally was my problem with it. And I think this point is worth stressing, particularly to friends outside the UK. If you were following the Brexit story, even in a country as close to us as Australia, you may have got the impression that Brexit was a nostalgic, nativist, even xenophobic movement. It was a kind of British version of Trump, anything even more so. And this happened, I think, because most people around the world tended to take their lead from those British media that were most hostile to the project, particularly the BBC, the Financial Times, the Economist. If we really had run the kind of anti-modern and anti-internationalist campaign that our detractors imagine, we would have lost pitifully. Right? We couldn't have won had we not made an essentially warm, liberal and internationalist case that we were going to do better, that we were infusing the vision of the future with a little hint of optimism, that the best is yet to come. And I think we were justified. I mean, we've now embarked on a radical liberalization of our trade deals overseas. I will be astonished a couple of years from now if the UK is not rated by the World Trade Organization as a more free trading country than the EU is. Once we left the EU, we were able to start importing Australian beef and stuff. We didn't have any problem with that. We'd been held back by these kind of protectionist tendencies in Brussels. Now, I think all of that was lost if you were looking at it from overseas. When I spoke to friends in Latin America, for example, they couldn't believe that I'd voted leave. They thought I was joking. You're a free market, educated. How can you possibly? And I would say, well, we want to be able to buy your sugar and all the rest of it. And these were arguments that had just not entered the equation at all. It was. I remember doing a radio interview in Mexico shortly after the vote, and the first question was, do you take any responsibility for the xenophobic attacks that are now being suffered by expatriate Mexicans in London? I said, what xenophobic? What are you talking about? But this had just sort of become embedded, this total fake news, that Britain had become a nastier place. So obviously, as one of the many annoying things about the closures of the last 16 months is that they never allowed us definitively to prove that Brexit was an economic success. We had 3 years where we outperformed the Eurozone. We had definitively disproved all of the gloomiest prognostications of the Remain campaign. Unemployment had fallen to its lowest ever level. Manufacturing was up. Exports were up. Growth was up. The stock exchange was up. By every measure, we were doing really well. And then, of course, this wrecking ball came in from the side and has zeroed the. But I'm convinced that we are in a better and more agile place to deal with that challenge than we would have been in the EU. And the first proof of that, of course, is that we were not part of the EU vaccination scheme, which means that I think we're now going to be able to come out of these lockdowns much earlier than our friends in Europe. Obviously, I want them to come out of it as well. I want, very important to stress, Brexit is not anti-Europe. We want our friends and allies to succeed. We want them to be rich. We want to have rich neighbors because they make good customers and we like them, right? But all of that said, I think the first test of an independent Britain demonstrated the advantages that come from flexibility.
An interesting thing for observers watching from this side of the world is that so many opinion leaders in Britain, including so many of the great institutions, the BBC, the Financial Times, major business and industry groups, the civil service, the universities, metropolitan elites, much of the media, it was an article of faith that to turn your back on Europe was just you suggest utter foolishness, economic ruin, laughable kind of parochial little Englandism. And yet Brexit succeeded and was then endorsed in a general election. So all those highly intelligent, powerful elites, how are they taking this? I mean, surely they still don't think they were wrong, do they?
Very good question. Some of them have adapted to the new reality. Never underestimate the power of what Milton Friedman, I think in a visit to Australia, called the tyranny of the status quo. So a lot of the sort of establishment, sort of CBI types, have now moved. I mean, I've noticed the change in their conversation. It went from "this is going to be a disaster" to "oh, this hasn't worked out as badly," and now they're saying, "Well, I almost voted leave. I was just on the cusp, and if I'd known what I now know about how things would work out, I would have probably voted leave." Give it one more year, and it'll be, "Oh, I was a Eurosceptic long before you were, Hannan." But then there is another part, and they are, I think, the minority, but they are very vocal, who cannot hide their annoyance at the fact that things went well. They put themselves in always a very ugly place to be. They put themselves in a position of wanting the country to fail so that they could be proved right. And of course, that's deeply unappealing, but it also sends you round the twist in the end. And one of the really sad aspects of Brexit has been to watch clever people, distinguished people, A.C. Grayling, Lord Adonis, even in his moments, Richard Dawkins, driven to this kind of dementia because of their determination that the country should go up in flames rather than them having to challenge their assumptions. And shall I tell you the oddest thing about this, Simon? It happened after the result. It didn't happen during the campaign. Referendums like elections are, divisive, but actually this one was no more divisive than any other election. I was out manning street stalls most days, and quite often we would run into Remain campaigners in their blue Stronger In t-shirts, and we'd pose for selfies together, we'd wish each other luck. It was still a civil conversation about sovereignty, trade, money, etc.
Because they didn't think it was going to happen.
Well, that's part of it. So there was the psychological shock. But the oddest thing is that the rage that then followed that psychological shock, it was really nothing about Europe. The conversation then was not about the EU at all. It was about an imagined internal enemy, racist, xenophobic, etc. And at that point, it went from being a polite conversation into being a terrible culture war defined by what kind of people did you imagine to be on the other side? Delete as appropriate, either working class oafs who fell for unscrupulous demagogues or smearing snobs who secretly hate their own country. And of course, there were a tiny number of such people on both sides. There were a few people who lived up to the stereotype. But once the conversation became like that, it became almost insoluble because it wasn't about, we couldn't, if you like, reassure people by saying, look, the economy has turned out okay, because they'd moved on to a whole different set of objections by then.
Very interesting. Thank you. And perhaps just one last quick one on where things will go now on Brexit. How do you see the future for Britain as a trading nation? And I'm thinking of the recently announced free trade agreement with Australia, which is to be signed by the end of this year, and also the Trans-Pacific, the CPTPP. Is the Anglosphere more of a reality, or going to be more of a reality in future through trade? What do you see as the major risks for the UK post EU?
Yeah, absolutely. We've signed our deal with Australia. We're going to be able to enjoy your wine more cheaply. We're going to be able to enjoy your beef more cheaply, etc., etc. The UK and Australia were fairly open economies. We, I hope, are going to announce a trade deal very soon with New Zealand. It may have already been announced by the time people are watching this. We are, of course, continuing to negotiate with the US. Those were our three priorities, the great English-speaking democracies. We have formally now applied to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Some of your viewers down under may be wondering what link we have geographically to the Pacific. The answer is that technically we qualify because we own the Pitcairn Islands, which are pretty much slap bang in the middle of the Pacific. But the true answer, of course, is that we are deeply aligned culturally to a number of CPTPP members, not only Australia, New Zealand, Canada, but the Malaysias and the Singapores and so on. I think two of the arguments that I made during the referendum for Brexit have been strengthened in a paradoxical way by the epidemic and the lockdowns. One of the arguments that I made was Europe is shrinking as a proportion of the world's economy. It's not shrinking in absolute terms, but it is growing much less fast than Australia or North America or South America or pretty much anywhere else, actually. Europe and Antarctica were the two zero growth areas. Every other continent was growing. That has become more true. The virus hit Europe much harder than it hit Africa or Asia or the Antipodes. So that relative decline has been accelerated, which if you like, increases the argument for a country like Britain to look further afield. But the other thing that's changed is we're all much more used to doing this, right? We're all much more accustomed than we were 2 years ago to holding conversations, even sensitive, important conversations, by Zoom or Teams. And that, I think, massively increases the value of cultural proximity rather than geographical proximity. The idea that when all travel restrictions are lifted, that people are going to go back in Britain to flying over to Dusseldorf to make a presentation, I forget it. It's for the birds. People are going to be looking further afield. It's already happening, actually, in our trade patterns. It happened the moment that the lockdowns hit. So I think we're going to see, if you like, a restoration of what we always had until the early 70s, which is a global Britain, part of a diverse, pluralist global market, involving the Commonwealth, involving the Anglosphere, bringing together a mix of different economies, some of them commodity-based, some of them agrarian, some of them services-based, some of them manufacturing-based. And that, it seems to me, is a far better place to be, because the whole purpose of trade is to swap on the back of differences. So the more varied your market, the better. And so I'm hugely optimistic in a world where there are protectionist tendencies, that at least Britain has now come back as a force for good, a force for liberalisation, and for lowering barriers so that we can deliver trade as the great poverty buster that it is.
Absolutely. Well, so we talked about Europe, Britain and Europe. I wonder if we could now perhaps turn to freedom on the world scale, and more specifically, maybe to external strategic challenges and threats to the freedom of Britain and even the West, I suppose, rather than economic opportunities. So I wonder if you'd talk to us a little bit about how, say, Russia and China as a pair are perceived, because I think the perspective in the UK possibly slightly different from the one in Australia. One thinks of President Putin's repeated, almost contemptuous dismissals of democracy, the West is past its use-by date, and so on and so forth. But of even more interest from an Australian point of view, China, as you know, is absolutely front and centre in our own country's strategic and economic thinking just now. And we've had to listen recently to President Xi's recent Great Wall of Steel speech on the 100th anniversary of the party, which you referred to as some, I think, hideous Leninism, the modern Communist Party in China. Nevertheless, the party has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. So, what do you see as the kind of real strategic goals for Russia and China? What President Putin, President Xi are really getting at? What they're really thinking about? How do those things balance out in your mind from a UK perspective?
Yes, I mean, I think the way China treated Australia, and at around the same time, the way it cracked down in Hong Kong, where the UK is the guarantor of the treaty, massively recalibrated views in London. Everything we knew about China turned out to be wrong. You know, we had been of the view all my life that China was on the path towards a more open society, that it would be a patchy and fitful process, but that nonetheless the trend was going to have to be towards a more law-based society, because people would, the argument was if you could choose your own mobile phone provider and so on, you would eventually start to expect choice in how you were governed. Boy, did we get that wrong. And I think we were very slow to wake up to the speed and intensity of the revolution unleashed by Xi Jinping, the way in which not only were the previous freedoms reversed, but in some ways the clock was turned back to, the 70s, to full Leninist control. I mean, as you say, the party may no longer be Marxist in the sense that it no longer believes in communist economics. It is definitely Leninist in the sense that it believes in the dictatorship of the party. One of the things that really caught us all off guard, or certainly I didn't predict, I had vaguely thought that the internet was bound to be a liberating force because it was decentralized, because it was outside government control. The Chinese have shown us how to make technology the servant of an autocratic state. They use notionally private companies, the Weibos, the Alibabas, the Tencents, as agents of both propaganda and spying. And they've created this terrifying panopticon state with face recognition technology and all the rest of it, which I think holds their people in a vice from which it's difficult to see them being released. And this has, of course, gone furthest in Xinjiang, where when you see those roadblocks on the news, what they're checking at the roadblocks is that people have not deleted the spyware that is mandatory on their phones. So every Uyghur has to have this app that monitors them for antisocial activity. Antisocial activity, what does that mean? It means anything from trying to make contact with foreigners to growing a beard or covering your hair if you're a woman. And the terrifying thing is that if you do too many of these antisocial things, the algorithm will have you whisked away to an internment camp without really any human supervision at all. Now, if they can do that in Xinjiang, they can do it in the rest of China. And here's a really scary thought. If they can do it in China, why not export it? Right? So in my native Peru, which is carrying on in as hopeless a political sense as it ever was, they have just elected, he was inaugurated a couple of days before we recorded this interview, they've just elected another proper Marxist-Leninist leader, unapologetic, ocean-going, chateau-bottled believer in communism. He says he's going to kick out the Western companies and they're going to have to respect Peruvian sovereignty and so on. Okay, if he kicks out the mining interests, which are a big part of the national wealth, where is he then going to turn? The answer is there is only one place he can turn, which will be to Beijing. I wonder whether, as well as the package they've been offering up until now, which is, vote with us on Taiwan and so on, and we'll look after you, I wonder whether they might not now say, and we can offer to install and run a surveillance system which will ensure that you never lose another election. If it can happen in China, why can't it happen in Peru? Why can't it happen everywhere? And so this deeply alarms me, because I think this is a powerful global trend, and that the most worrying thing is how little the Chinese seem to object to it. That even Chinese students abroad show no interest when they're outside the firewalls in Googling stuff that's been challenged.
This is something I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on. As far as ordinary Chinese people are concerned, I mean, many of them easily old enough to remember the horrors of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, extreme poverty, starvation, etc. As far as they're concerned, what's been delivered to them is unimaginable, relatively speaking, unimaginable prosperity, security, and so on. So how would one even begin to make the argument to these people, to such people, ordinary Chinese folks, that they haven't got this magic thing called freedom, when they will simply say, but good Lord, we're so much more secure, so much more prosperous, our children have a future. How does one respond to this? What would you say?
Isn't that a depressing thought? So you opened, Simon, by saying you'd heard from Patrick Deneen saying that, liberalism was finished, and from Deirdre McCluskey saying that it had made us all rich. Those two propositions can both be true. It may be that we have been living through a very unusual liberal interlude, and that the relative rise of non-Anglosphere powers will be seen as, if you like, the end of that interglacial, the end of those 200 or 300 years when the individual was elevated above the collective. And of course, you're right. Most people prefer safety to freedom, and this isn't some peculiarly Chinese characteristic, right? Even 2 years ago, you or I might have said, well, that kind of surveillance state that they've created in China, that autocracy, could never happen in an open society like Australia or the UK. But when I look at how people responded to the restrictions brought in the name of combating the coronavirus, I no longer believe that. I don't think that is a sustainable proposition anymore. In fact, here, every move to lift the restrictions and to restore what should be fundamental freedoms was carried out in the teeth of public resistance. People actually wanted more lockdown all for its own sake once they were frightened. So I'm afraid it's a very bleak outlook. But just one last point, if I may, when you say people can remember the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and of course they can remember those things, but in a rather 1984 sense, there is almost no public acknowledgement of them. And it's amazing how quickly things drop out of vision once they become undiscussed. And by the way, again, this isn't a peculiarly Chinese thing, right? I mean, it can happen in a free society as well. If I think of, for example, the way in which the many Irish volunteers who fought for the Anglosphere in the two world wars were airbrushed out of history, that wasn't the result of an autocratic state. It was just simply a sort of embarrassed silence about it. Again, people remembered it, right? They had children, they knew it had happened, but it very quickly dropped out of the national conversation. The same has happened with things that the party doesn't want to talk about. And for me, one of the scariest surveys I saw was of 100 students of the University of Peking who were outside China. And they were shown the picture. If I say to you Tiananmen Square, right, the picture now in your mind of the tank guy, right, they were shown that picture. And they were asked where it was. Now, it's Tiananmen Square, for heaven's sake, right? It's the equivalent of having the Sydney Harbour Bridge in the background or Trafalgar Square. You'd think you'd recognize it from the landmarks. Only 15 of the 100 thought that it was in China. All of the others said it would be in Vietnam or North Korea or something. Now, this isn't just Orwell. This is Huxley now. This is people who choose what to look at things. They are happy in their servitude because, as you say, the state has created incentives that make them not want to choose freedom. And I'm afraid I think that could happen anywhere. I think that is the natural condition of most human societies for the last 10,000 years. My goodness, we may look back wistfully on the era that is now coming to an end.
Interglacial. A new ice age is coming. In the words of Game of Thrones. So, Dan, if we can switch then from external challenges and threats to freedom to what you might call internal ones, intra-Western or intra-Anglosphere threats. I mean, you've written about the sun setting on the Anglosphere imperium. If you think about our long-standing liberal inheritance, the importance of elected governments, habeas corpus, equality before the law, trial by jury, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, all of that. Is there now even any such thing anymore internally to the Anglosphere as a conception of freedom or the importance of these institutions of liberty? And I'm just thinking, I mean, it's been much more marked in the last year or two, but the cancel culture movements of recent years, the disappearance of a sensible centre in politics in so many countries, an almost unbridgeable divide, it seems, between Democrats and Republicans in the US, and maybe even more than these things, a kind of divide between the generations, where so many young people now declare themselves not to support democracy. I mean, huge percentages in polls in the United States say this. I think it's something like 3/4. And then there's a related social media phenomenon. So many institutions, newspapers, publishers, universities, large corporations seem supine in the face of concerted, hostile campaigns by younger people who so intensely disapprove of somebody who doesn't share their views on gender or race or religion or climate that the institutions cave in almost at once and fire people or cancel contracts or admit their privilege or whatever it is. What's your take on all of this stuff? I mean, is freedom in the longer term under threat here?
It's difficult, I'm afraid, to avoid that conclusion. This is a second law of thermodynamics, isn't it? Things revert to a natural condition. Jonah Goldberg wrote a wonderful book about this, where he said, if you leave a car in the middle of a field, enough time will pass that eventually there'll be no sign that it was ever there. Nature will pour back in. And why imagine that the artificial liberal society that we have lucked out and enjoyed for the last couple of 100 years is any different? All of what we're doing, everything that we enjoy is quite unnatural. We evolved in kin groups. We are a tribal, hierarchical species. When you say people don't believe in democracy, the weird thing is that they ever did. The weird thing is that enough people were ever convinced that they should elevate process over outcome, that they should care enough about the rules that they accept the victory of the guy that they didn't want as the candidate. How unnatural to our species to be more loyal to a bit of paper that lays down the Constitution than to a flesh and blood candidate who's like your, as it were, tribal champion, right? It was amazing that we ever did that. And Hannah Arendt, the Eichmann trial writer, she had a lovely phrase where she said, every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And what she means by that is, you and I came into the world with pretty much the same mental apparatus that we would have done 5,000 years ago, right? The reason that our world is not the world of 5,000 years ago is because of the process of acculturation. We've been taught lots of things that don't come naturally. For example, we've been taught, very difficult idea, that people that we don't like might still have useful things to say. We've been taught that truth is something that you can work towards empirically, scientifically, through debate and experimentation. We've been taught that letting people do things that you disagree with creates sort of a cacophony of different ideas out of which better things will come. All of these are very difficult ideas. You observe people's behavior online and you see that none of this comes naturally. It all has to be taught. Now, here's what worries me. It's not just that we're not teaching it. It's not just that universities and, to some degree, secondary schools have given up that counter-cyclical function of drawing people out of their Pleistocene heuristics, overcoming the inner caveman and teaching them these difficult and artificial liberal nostrums. It's that universities are doing the opposite. They become pro-cyclical. They're teaching us that the only important thing about us is that we're black or white or male or female or gay or whatever it is. In other words, we're reverting to the kind of tribalism that defined early civilization and probably the million years of hunter-gatherer existence before that. And what scares me about it is that it comes very naturally to people. It's in our genes. So you might say, well, hang on, Hannan, if that's right, why is cancel culture and wokery so unpopular? Well, it's unpopular on one level, but the backlash to it, I have to say, is Trumpy rather than libertarian, right? The backlash to it is a different kind of tribalism from a different lot of people who repeatedly told that the only important thing about them is that they're white, begin eventually to identify that way. And the idea that what you and I would have been brought up to see as the liberal ideal of a society where we are all valued as individuals, not as members of some caste or group, where we're not defined by accident physiognomy, where we're all responsible for ourselves, I think that idea is being lost in precisely the places that should be the temples of the Enlightenment, i.e. the universities. And that's why the standard conservative response to the great awakening of the last 5 years, which is to go harumph, political correctness gone mad, shocking, these silly young people, is hugely inadequate. I think what we're seeing is something much more dangerous, which is a reversion to the pre-modern idea of caste and tribe. And once that takes hold, we may never again be able to recapture the elevation of the individual that's been the defining landmark of English-speaking civilization.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting. It almost seems as if the notion of identity has collapsed a kind of complex model of the self, which has many different dimensions and is very diverse, into a single dimension, which is whatever the identity characteristic is that you're talking about. So it's a kind of thinning out of the notion of the individual. But so I just want to ask you this. It's striking, at least it is to me, that so much of this almost Salem-like behavior in the cancel culture movement, it seems to take place much more markedly, much more hysterically, really, in the Anglosphere than it does for example, in continental Europe. Why is that? Why is it that these phenomena that you're talking about seem to have erupted in what you previously thought were the more tolerant and diverse of Western cultures? Why are they the ones that have given birth to these extraordinarily kind of undiverse, single identity-based movements? Why would that be?
Well, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff wrote a book about 5 years ago called The Cuddling of the American Mind, which is an analysis of this takeover, particularly of the academy.
John spoke to us at the Ramsay Center a couple of years ago, actually. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, the idea. So one of the things that they did, which I thought was very telling, is they tried to measure when this phenomenon had taken off by an analysis of the vocabulary. And they looked at the phrases that we associate with the Great Awakening. Phrases such as safe space, trigger warning, microaggression, cultural appropriation. And they found that basically these phrases didn't exist in any meaningful sense until about 2015. This has been a remarkably recent process. And I think 2020 will be remembered as the year that it spilled off campus and infected the general population in the form of the BLM protests. Why has it happened in the Anglosphere? I asked Jonathan Haidt that. He's a great guru of mine. I always see him whenever I'm in the US, and I think he's one of the most interesting and important thinkers around. And I said to him, why is this? And he said, it is, you're right. He said it's an Anglosphere phenomenon. He unselfconsciously used that word. He said, because there's two things. First of all, the Anglosphere is a cultural continuum. So he said the very fact that it began in the US will be enough to put the French off doing it, which there's some truth in that. But he said the other thing, and this I thought was really interesting, he said, you need to have young people lifted out of their community to be properly indoctrinated in this way of thinking. Anglosphere universities, he said, are all ultimately, or at least the elite ones, are all ultimately modelled on Oxford and Cambridge. They are residential and elite. You don't get woke at technical colleges. You don't get woke where people are living at home with the amused reaction of their parents or with the amused reaction of their workmates. It's not something you can do while going to work every day. You need to get these kids in a purity spiral where they're surrounded by others like them. But I'm afraid that's now happened. I mean, I had that conversation with him a couple of years ago, and I think it has now gone way beyond campus. And it's taken, I mean, I was at Oriel, which was the epicenter of this because it's the place that had the Rhodes statue. And I was in Oxford last week, and I was talking to some young people, and I made the point that Cecil Rhodes was not the cartoonish character of BLM fantasy. That he had funded the newspaper of what's now the ANC. He'd campaigned against the disfranchisement of black people in Cape Colony, and when he created his scholarships, he laid down that race and religion shouldn't qualify or disqualify any candidate. A fifth of the beneficiaries from Africa, etc. I said, of course, he was a flawed human being, but he was a flesh and blood character, not this emblem of evil colonialism. And the response of these kids, who were all white, was, you don't get to have an opinion about this, white man. How do your so-called facts get to trump the hurt suffered by minority students who have to walk past this statue? I mean, you have to really crane your neck to be offended by it. It's a tiny little statuette in a niche. But and again, that's this profoundly anti-Enlightenment idea, right? What it's doing is saying everything that you and I thought was the basis of reason and science is junked because my feelings trump your facts, or someone else's feelings trump your facts. And of course, that is the pre-modern way of looking at the world, that there was some supreme truth interpreted by some sacerdotal class, and you couldn't question it. It's a truly scary thing that this is happening in Oxford, and yet, of course, it has spread through every Oxford-modelled university in the English-speaking world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so let's come full circle now, Dan, and come back to our title and whether COVID is the last straw that's broken the back of freedom. And you've mentioned this briefly already, but the popular medical and government responses to the pandemic in your country, in Australia, in the United States have been very divergent, of course, but they have had something in common. I mean, Freedom Day, as we were talking about just before we started recording, Freedom Day has just supposedly happened in the UK. Has it come too late? Because, in the West, not in China, I mean, it's not so striking there, but in the West, we've seen populations everywhere shut. I mean, yes, in China, but it's not surprising there. In the West, we've seen populations shut into their houses, effectively often chased home under police direction, and people are surprisingly compliant. So what's that? Is this an entirely justifiable, is this fear of the disease? Is this the sense that people out there in the streets protesting are utterly irresponsible and are spreading the disease to older people? Why do lockdowns seem to be such sure vote winners? I mean, obviously nobody wants thousands of deaths. Australia and Britain are in a very different situation in this respect. But whatever your view on the weighing of the risks, has it been an unintended consequence of the Western response to the pandemic that we've all accepted a kind of irreversible decline in our freedoms, a surrender of power to the state or to unelected health bureaucrats? Talk to us a bit about this.
The worst of it is that we haven't just accepted it; we've demanded it. We have been more pro-lockdown than the governments in most cases. An observer from another planet, looking only at the texture of daily life, would conclude that the UK and Australia were more tyrannical societies than Russia or China. If you were just looking at, are the restaurants open, are people able to enjoy their property, are they able to travel abroad and so on, looking simply at the sort of the daily quotidian existence of people, they would assume that the Anglosphere societies were uniquely repressive autocracies. How did that happen? Of course, people are prepared to make a contingent trade-off where they allow a temporary restriction of some liberty in exchange for visible gains. And that we do that in war or whatever. But it becomes increasingly clear that we got the balance massively wrong. I noticed last week that the 7-day rolling death count in Sweden for several days now has been 0. Right? It's been in single figures since May. And Sweden became a sort of football, and people were quoting it in depending on what their sort of starting assumptions were. But the thing I think is pretty undeniable about Sweden is that the infections didn't go exponential there. It didn't have a lockdown. It had some restrictions. You couldn't have very big meetings, but it basically said to people, use your common sense. And that was enough. Their healthcare system wasn't overwhelmed, and they came out of it with a much less damaged economy, but for our purposes, more importantly, a much less damaged civil society. Why didn't we do that? Why globally was there this readiness to demand more state action? I think it has to do with the psychological changes occasioned by the sense of a common threat. It changes our brain chemistry. It makes us more illiberal, more introverted. We want to hunker down. We want to avoid strangers. We think on some deep level they probably carry pathogens. We become more protectionist. The last time we had a shared collective threat, or at least a perception of one on this level, was probably the Second World War. And if you look at what happened then, after 1945, the state turned out to be very reluctant to return the freedoms that it had taken on a supposedly emergency basis. So in the UK, we had identity cards until 1952. We had food rationing until 1954. We had full conscription until 1960. And when you look at the economic controls that were supposedly brought in during the mobilization, they really lasted until the Thatcher reforms in the 80s. And in fact, if you look at our education and healthcare systems, large elements of them are still there today. Things that were brought in under full mobilization. Why? Because the public demanded it afterwards. We had become a more collectivist people as a result of that sense of common threat. And this is what makes me very gloomy about the chances of freedom, even as the virus becomes managed. Right. So I think in this country we're definitely in the final furlong now. Right. We've got a combination of acquired immunity and vaccine immunity that means that we've been able to reopen without any really significant increase in hospitalizations or mortality. It's not to say that no one's going to die of it. I mean, of course not, but the governments can't abolish death. But this is now a manageable disease, like influenza or whatever. And yet people continue to oppose reopening. They continue to hanker after these demands. There was even a poll the other day that showed that 26% of people wanted nightclubs and casinos to be permanently closed, right? Not in response to coronavirus, but just as an objective in itself. 19% of people wanted a 10 p.m. curfew, not because of the virus, just as a good thing to do. Those figures, I'm afraid, reflect the tribalism and the switches that are afflicting on our brains when we feel under a threat, under a sense of collective menace. And I'm afraid it'll be a long time, if ever, before we get past it.
Well, so maybe in closing, we can try and think not too pessimistically, but about what one might do to address some of these concerns you have, that we are in some kind of brief 200-year interregnum between two normal conditions of illiberalism. I mean, we talked about China and Russia in this respect, and now these internal threats to freedom. Do you think that we are kind of, as human beings, irredeemably complacent about freedom itself as a distinct good? I mean, most people care a lot more about material security and prosperity than they do about some abstract notion of freedom. How do you advocate for what you might call the presumption of freedom? On the analogy of presumption of innocence, how do you get the message across that freedom is always a positive good in itself, to be weighed in the balance by our leaders and decision makers, along with all the other factors when taking political decisions? How do you make that case?
Okay, how do we get back to freedom? First, you teach it. Right, you have to teach it. You have to inculcate these counter-cyclical ideas. You have to start when kids are quite young. Now, we all did that, right? We all got it from our parents in all sorts of little ways. Their ways may seem strange to us, but we probably seem strange to them. The sense of sort of fairness and responsibility that you start teaching kids when they're very small. And then as they get older, you introduce them to J.S. Mill, you introduce them to John Locke, you introduce them to Milton, you get them to read the right stuff. Now, that's surprisingly rare now. It's very possible to get through a degree, in politics, philosophy, and economics without really coming across any of those texts, let alone a degree in sociology or something, right? So I think we need to look quite hard at what we're teaching people. And then we also need to model good behavior. There's no point in teaching free expression as an abstract principle if you're not prepared to model it. So I was teaching at a summer school last week, something called the John Locke Institute, run by a British Australian. And he's very good at modeling. So, for example, he would have the kids doing what they call the ideological Turing test. He'd organize debates, and you had to try and guess whether the person really believed, what they were saying. He was getting people to argue points that they fundamentally disagreed with, but could they do it well enough to fool people, like a computer fooling someone into thinking that it's a human being? That, I think, should be a standard. That should be a part of how we teach people. And I'm afraid we're doing the opposite. We're from a very young age, we are teaching kids effectively critical race theory and its offshoots. I saw my 4-year-old, he was 5 last week, he was 4 at the time, watching the kind of program that's aimed at 4-year-olds. And there was a sort of thing between the cartoons of a black ballerina who seemed a very nice lady and very impressive and everything, talking about all the struggles she'd had to overcome and the racism and the structural problems and how she'd always had to work harder than anyone else. Have we really given much thought to what it's like for a kid, a black 4-year-old, being told from the moment that they're able to understand the concept that everything is loaded against them, that they're never going to get a fair go, as you blokes say, right? It seems to me that this is a really understudied aspect woke. Greg Lukianoff, again, makes the point, he's a big fan of cognitive behavioral therapy. And he says that the thing about cognitive behavioral therapy is it's about showing you that you're in control, that if you put your mind to something, you can do it. And this is how you get rid of people's anxiety. And he says, if you wanted to do the opposite, if you wanted to create mental health problems, you would do this. You tell people that the world is stacked against them. I think that is a really underexplored aspect of woke, the extent to which it's damaging. It's aimed at white people, but I think people have not taken the impact on minorities fully into account. Well, Thomas Sowell had this lovely phrase where he said, you can't have a society where two babies born on the same day are assumed to have a set of pre-existing grievances based on how they. That's what we should be teaching. Now, if it were up to me, Simon, you know what I would do? I would create a Center for Western Civilization, and I would try and teach it. I would try and teach those concepts not only on campus but in schools. I'd have essay prizes. I'd have people going into the classroom, because unless we do that, it's the Hannah Arendt point. We're invaded by barbarians, and in families and in classrooms, we have to teach people the fundamentally difficult idea that the rules matter more than the outcome, and that the individual matters more than the caste.
Wonderful. That seems like a good note to finish on. Lord Hannan, Dan, thank you so much for talking to us. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'd just like to thank you on behalf of the Ramsay Centre and all of our listeners. And what can I say? I hope next time we'll be able to see you in person in Australia when we're all opened up again. So thank you very much indeed.
Nothing will make me happier. I have missed terrific. Even seeing you here is making me think I really ought to be in the under the wide open skies with the people with the matching expansive personalities. So as soon as it opens up, let's do that.